What's going on? I'm Dan, this is my shop, and today I'm going to make this jewelry box with my Shaper Origin, and I'm going to design the whole thing in Shaper Hub and not use any CAD software, just to show you how easy it is to make something on the fly. This isn't sponsored, I just really like it, and I thought this was kind of a cool way to show you how Shaper Labs works and what the Shaper Origin is capable of. Check it out. So I recently traveled to Denmark, and while in a store there, I saw this jewelry box that was really interesting, and my wife thought it was interesting as well. And so I was like, let me see if I can refabricate this in Shaper Labs. Now, I could have certainly just bought it, and that would have been great. But I kind of wanted to see how I could do this in Shaper Labs, and I thought this was a good way to show folks kind of the benefit of it. This is a free software that Shaper put out not too long ago, and it's really easy to use. Prior to this, you'd have to use something like Illustrator or a different CAD software to create an SVG file and send that over to the Shaper. And if you understand something like Microsoft Word, you're gonna know how to adjust boxes, the triangles, the circles, to create shapes that then can be cut out directly on the Shaper. What's nice about this also is in Illustrator, you used to have to color code the lines and do some things that just weren't super difficult, but it was just kind of extra steps. And here, you don't have to color code the lines for certain cuts. You just make the shapes, whatever you want, and then you can do any kind of cut based on the lines in the shape. You can do online, you can do a pocket cut, you can do inside or outside cuts. Again, if you have a Shaper, you know what that means. If you don't, that's just different ways to cut. Now, the other really nice thing is it's easy to adjust. So obviously you make a lot of mistakes sometimes doing this stuff. That will become a theme in this video. And you can easily copy and paste things, delete things, add things. You can do Control-Z to undo things if you're familiar with those kind of basic shortcuts. And you can ultimately have a really, what would be kind of complex piece somewhat simply through this software. The last thing I'm doing here is just making a second box so that I have an ability to make that lid, which you'll see as I work through the design. So the first thing I had to do was find some wood. I chose beech initially. You'll see that ended up changing to oak because right here is the classic example of measure once, cut twice. Now, I think that statement is usually said otherwise, but I decided to just really make a fool out of it and cut it wrong. What happened was I measured from the side because I wanted to get rid of some checking on the wood, and I ended up just cutting it too short, which I come to realize as soon as I try to put the design I made over the piece. It needs to be 12 inches by 7 inches. I ended up milling this thing to 10 inches by 7 inches because of how I cut initially there. At this point, though, I'm innocent and feeling great about myself, and I'm going to tell you all about how excited I am right here. So now I have two pieces of beech that are 12 inches by 7 inches. This is going to be the bottom and the top. The top is slightly thinner than the bottom. And I'm going to take it over to the Shaper, and that's going to do the rest of the work here. And you're going to see how it goes from that design to a finished product. And here I'm just setting up the Shaper with the double-sided tape and putting my beech down as such a confident person I was here. And I'm going to realize that it's not the right size once I put in the design. You have to hover the design over your piece, and I realized it was too short. And I'll spare you from any redundant millwork because the process was exactly the same. Here's that newly milled red oak, and this is going to work a lot better because the bottom is going to be a lot thicker than the original pieces, and obviously the length is the right size, which helps a lot. Now I can put these together, and we're going to have a really nice top and bottom. And I was a little bit worried about whether or not in the original ones that I cut, the weight of this piece was going to pull back on that makeup, whatever jewelry, whatever this thing is. Anyway, I was worried that that might tip back, but here it's not going to be a problem. This is super heavy, and it's going to hold that up just fine. So sometimes you make mistakes and you get to play with your tools again. So, you know, that's kind of fun. Let's take it over to the Shaper and now actually cut out those parts. So one of the benefits from obviously cutting your piece to the right dimensions is your design in Shaper Labs will line up perfectly. You just want to make sure that it is exactly on the right spot, and the camera in the shaper makes that a pretty easy process. And you can see here, then it's just a matter of cutting out those different pieces, which, you know, takes a little bit of time. It is ultimately a router, so you only have as much speed as, you know, any kind of router might give you in cutting out. But you can see here, I hogged out slowly those different pockets. If I were to do this again, I would absolutely suggest using a Forstner bit to cut out the bulk of things. What I found is it was just a lot of time using a 1/4-inch bit to hog that out. Shaper supposedly just released some new bits that are a little bit better for hogging out such a piece. And you can always just use any 1/4-inch bit that you might find. But I thought I would give it a shot and just see kind of how that goes. You'll see I grew kind of frustrated hogging out so much here when I take it over. After kind of doing a whole bunch of passes, I take it over to my bench and just use a chisel and kind of like knock that wood out. And that works fine. It ultimately is just, again, one way you could do this. There are a lot of different ways you can hog out wood. So after that work on the shaper is done, it comes to refining what's inside. And that can be a real pain depending on the sanding you have to do. In this kind of cut, you have all these small pockets, and there's some slight errors where the bit maybe jumped a little bit because I was probably hogging away too much at a time. And so I've purchased these little kind of Dremel attachments. They're just little sanding pads, and they're really helpful because you can get right to the base of that cup, and that's going to help me sand these really much more easily than if I tried to, you know, hand sand it or get anything else in there. So that Dremel is going to help with all these little detail finishes so that it looks like a really nice refined piece. And here I do my best impression of a dentist. One thing I learned as I went through this using this sanding tool is if you stay really light and it's directly vertical, it's going to be fine. If you push down too much though, you can have one of those discs just fly off. So obviously wear eye protection. I'm wearing a mask also because obviously you can see all that dust. But the more you either just lightly hold it against the wood, or if you're doing any kind of angles, just keep it at an angle. That's going to work just fine. And after getting those bottoms as clean as I kind of could get them, I took it over to the drill press, and I have just a sanding attachment and was able to get the walls of it. Obviously with small areas here, that gets a little bit tricky, and it was fortunate that I made the pockets big enough that I could work with this bit. And you can see here I'm trying to clean up where the bit in the shaper jumped a little bit because I was trying to hog out too much. And ultimately I got it clean, and then had to clean, you know, my drum a whole bunch of times, but it made for decent work. Look at that satisfying cleaning. Ugh. Anyway, then I sanded the sides once the lid was on, just to make sure that they cohere well. I didn't want it to be kind of mismatched at all, and this really helped. I was able to round over the sides to make it closer to what it'll ultimately look like at the end. So yeah, this is just a lot of sanding, which is thrilling. It's the best possible content on YouTube. I had pocketed out a little bit of an extra recess for the mirror there, so I was checking that that fits. And then I noticed that the pocket I made originally called for a 1-inch thick top, and my top ended up being about 5/8 inch thick, so that was a problem. But pretty easily solvable. I just had to cut a small strip of wood that I'm doing here on the table saw, and then I could just use some CA glue and put it in there, and that's going to allow it to stand just fine. Okay, so off camera, I sanded this a little bit more and then used Rubio Monocoat to finish it. Rubio is great. I like it. I know there's a lot of debate right now about finishes. But when you have something that has all of these little nooks and crannies, it's not my favorite. I might have just done like a spray lacquer or something like that, and that might have been a little bit faster. But ultimately, it worked, and I think it's quite nice. Thanks for watching. I'll have a lot more videos on Shaper and builds with Shaper. I have one upcoming on a desk build, so if you're interested, subscribing is great, and I will hopefully see you next time.